Welcome to the Candice Malcolm Show. I'm Kris Sims. I'm the Alberta Director for the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. I'm filling in for Candice today on this show. On this show, we're going to get into pipelines, resources, does Mark Carney really mean it? And finish off with the electric vehicle mandate. Don't you want the government telling you what car to buy? No? Well, stay tuned for that because we've got a rip-roaring conversation with Edmonton Sun columnist Lorne Gunter. But first, a little bit of news here. Okay, so over the weekend, something interesting happened. Remember how BC Premier David Eby had a come-to-Jesus moment over the carbon tax? Yeah, that guy. The one who had his own version of the carbon tax in British Columbia, the one who kept on cranking it up, the one who hasn't met a resource project that he hasn't wanted to strangle, the same guy who's piling on massive amounts of debt in British Columbia, inexplicably. That premier, remember how he was kind of singing from the Team Canada hymn book for a little while of, oh, let's actually do elbows up. Let's make sure that we can all be in this together. Well, he's kind of squishing on that now. He came out and said, generally speaking, maybe we shouldn't necessarily have pipelines and it's not such a good idea. And oh, the Trans Mountain Pipeline, which used to be owned by Kinder Morgan, the Trans Mountain Pipeline, not super running at capacity. He got a lot of blowback over that, obviously, but now he's trying to put a little bit of water in his wine. Now he's saying, oh, what I meant was, we don't want public money going into pipelines. Public money, by the way, is taxpayers' money. There's no such thing as government money. He actually went on CTV over the weekend, and he's trying to peddle this backwards now, saying, no public money for pipelines is what I meant. Listen to this.
I don't support tens of billions of dollars in federal subsidy for a brand new pipeline across the north, getting rid of the tanker ban off the north coast.
There is not a world in which that pipeline across the north happens without significant federal subsidy. If the Premier of Alberta is able to pull that off, I say more power to her.
Why do you assume that federal subsidies would be needed?
They were needed for the last one.
Yeah, they were needed for the last one, but they haven't been needed for everyone.
Okay, so here's the thing. Anyone who's been paying attention to this issue in a serious manner, especially for those of us out west, hello, I'm in Lethbridge, Alberta, none of us want taxpayers' money going into pipelines. It's so frustrating when we hear folks, especially the Laurentians in the Eastern media, which are funded largely by the government, say, we bought you a pipeline. Why don't you Westerners sit down and be quiet and be grateful? We didn't want the government to buy a pipeline. We didn't want the government to build and twin a pipeline next to that existing pipeline. What we wanted was for the government to be reasonable and sensible and to get out of the way. What happened with that pipeline that runs from Edmonton across the Rockies into Burnaby and out to port, okay, what happened there was ridiculous. The original pipeline was owned by a private company, Kinder Morgan. That private company was going to use its own money to hire a whole bunch of people between Edmonton and Burnaby and to twin its existing pipeline. What that means for anyone who hasn't actually stood near a pipeline, there's a clearing, okay, through the woods. It's literally just looks like a flat piece of meadow that is mowed all the way to Alberta, okay? What they wanted to do is take that existing pipeline that's already there with the land around it, all of the tests have been done, and twin it. That's all they wanted to do. And it was supposed to be a multi-use pipeline, which means they could push things like bitumen or other oil products through it as they wanted to. They got green lights for a long time from the federal government, which is why Kinder Morgan was putting their money into it, okay? And they were going to employ people. They were going to employ people to the extent that these are like mortgage-paying jobs. These are serious jobs. To put it this way, the property taxes paid by Kinder Morgan back in the day more than paid for the entire recycling and garbage system for the city of Burnaby. That's how much money and wealth these private companies produce when they're allowed to do their thing. But that's the catch. They weren't allowed to do their thing. The feds put up roadblock after roadblock. They dragged their heels. They ragged the puck. And in that world, time is money. Like that company sitting there twiddling its thumbs and money is just going out the door and no shovels were in the ground. So that company eventually threw its hand up in frustration and walked away. Now, due to outcry from areas like Alberta, Saskatchewan to an extent, and some areas of British Columbia who do value natural resources, a lot of people got understandably upset. And so then the federal government, the same level that was strangling the pipeline in the first place, decided to swoop in to the rescue and build it and twin it themselves. By the time the smoke clears on this thing, the now newly named Trans Mountain Pipeline is going to cost taxpayers around $30 billion-ish. So we went from a private company wanting to spend its own money. They were guesstimating 8 to 10 billion, but it doesn't matter because it was their own money, employing people, to taxpayers being on the hook for it, and it being about $30 billion. The problem here is this has allowed folks, especially back east, to play cute. They get to play dumb now and say, oh, well, we bought you a pipeline. What else do you want us to do? And it's super annoying to see the Premier of British Columbia, where I'm from, and who knows better, to use that talking point. He knows what he's doing because he's on with Vasi. He's on with the CTV Parliamentary Bureau. It's right across the street from Parliament Hill. He knows that audience could largely just swallow that. But those of us who understand how the resource system works here in Canada, and especially the history behind that pipeline, know what's actually true. So, for the record, most Canadian taxpayers don't want the federal government or any government building pipelines. They want governments to get out of the way so that companies can build pipelines. Next up, we're going to find out what Lorne Gunter thinks of this and also touch on what's really interesting happening right now in central Alberta. I was just in Sundre, Alberta. In central Alberta, right there, we're having a provincial by-election. Usually that might be a bit of a snooze fest. Not this time, because we have some independent-seeking MLAs who are running for seats in the legislature. So let's find out. Joining me now is a good friend of the program, Lorne Gunter. Of course, Mr. Gunter writes columns for the Edmonton Sun, and of course, you see his columns elsewhere in the Sun media newspaper chain. We're old colleagues from back in the day when Sun News Network used to be on TV. Miss Lorne, I wanted to get into a few things with you. Right off the top, the kind of newsy element is, of course, the by-election that is happening provincially. Now, I was just at the Sundre Rodeo, and I know that the by-election isn't technically happening in Sundre, but it's in this kind of little shape of the riding that goes around Sundre. Interesting, on the way up, I wanted to raise this with you. I was driving up the 22, beautiful secondary highway, by the way, the Cowboy Trail, and I noticed these big red signs with, this kind of neat looking white font of the name of the person running there. And I'm in the movement and I had to think hard about, why is there a Liberal running? What? And my kids who were in the pickup truck with me just said out loud, Mama, why is there so many Liberal signs around here? I wanted to get your thoughts on this, on the Republican candidate who picked red for obvious reasons, because that's the color of the Republican Party in the States. I'm a little bit concerned about the branding on his behalf here. What did you think about this?
Yeah, I think there's two problems with it. One is the most obvious, the one that you've mentioned, and that is that the color scheme and the font look like federal Liberal signs. Well, in Alberta, that's not who you want to be associated with. So a casual driver going by on the highway who does live in the riding and will maybe vote on June 23rd in the by-election is very likely to think, there's certainly a good possibility that person will think that Cameron Davies, who's running for the Alberta Republican Party, not the Liberals, is a Liberal. And the Liberals know that this riding is so bad for them. They didn't run a candidate in the general election in 2023, and they have no candidate in the by-election. So this looks like Cameron Davies is the Liberal candidate, and I think he's toast. The other problem he has with his branding is this Alberta Republican Party. This is probably one of the parts of the province where Republicans are still reasonably popular. There would still be a fairly strong movement among separatists, not among the general populace in the riding, but among separatists, to quit Canada and become the 51st state. But as you will know from having seen polling for the last 3 or 4 months, Donald Trump's taunting of Canada about becoming the 51st state has destroyed conservative Canadians' views of the Republican Party. And so here he is. This is Cameron Davies, who until April 24th was a UCP member, who now has a party called the Republican Party and has colors like the Liberal Party. I just think that it's really bad branding all around.
It is bad branding. Been in the game for a long time. And again, I had to think hard. I'm like, I was about to tell the children, oh, no, honey, that's because it's public land and anybody can put it by the side. And I'm like, oh, no, wait. Cam, of course, is the Republican Party. And to your point with U.S. President Donald Trump, a lot of people will put what happened during the federal election at his feet. And that is what caused a lot of the kind of strange buzzword elbows up without any substance behind it nonsense that happened during the election. Now, the one element the Taxpayers Federation was happy about is that we do have technically the consumer carbon tax down to zero. So, cost of gas is still about 20 cents cheaper at the pumps. That's a good thing. Some folks I've been speaking with are happy-ish with Bill C-5, and they're kind of optimistic. I know Premier Daniel Smith is sounding kind of optimistic when it comes to getting things like pipelines done and natural resources actually on the roll here in Canada. But yeah, I don't want to belabor it because, of course, everybody's allowed to run, and I see a lot of support for, I would describe it as Alberta sovereignty, of just standing up for rights of Albertans. The really simple billboard of more Alberta, less Ottawa. That still plays well. But to your point, I'm not sure bright red with white font and the word Republican works.
And the other thing is, you look at these Davies posters, and the acknowledgement that it's the Republican Party is very tiny. Like, if you're driving by at highway speed, you're not going to see it. You'll see it if you're stopped somewhere and there's a sign, say in the corner of the gas station lot or something. You'll be able to tell that it's the Republican Party. But I think it's just very, very bad branding. The other problem that they're going to have, and I predict that the separatists will not win. It will not surprise me if they finish ahead of the NDP in second place, but even that seems like a bit of an outside stretch. But the other part of the problem is you're talking about Alberta sovereignty rather than necessarily separation. And Smith from the UCP, the premier, gets an awful lot of support for that. She has been a sovereigntist, and I think that buys her some time right now. Now, if there's an outrage that the Ottawa Liberals foist on Alberta, if there's an NEP2, if they're going to start, there's two big things that the provincial government is worried about Ottawa doing. One is is increasing the taxes on oil and gas to pay for the subsidies they want to give manufacturers in Ontario and Quebec because of the American tariffs. If that happens, that to me is an NEP2. I'm going to be unhappy about that. And the other thing they're worried about, and this is the thing I'm really worried about, is that the Liberals are going to, at some point, say there's no business case. They said there was no business case for LNG. They're going to say there's no business case for a new pipeline. We would go for a pipeline. Oh, sure we would. Yes, that's part of our nation building. Yes, we'd love to have a new pipeline. But no private company has stepped forward to put the money up. And, so we're just going to have to go without one. That's exactly what they want to happen in Ottawa. They have made it so difficult for a private company to step forward and say, look, we'll risk the $13, $14, $15 billion on a pipeline. They made it so difficult for a company to do that there aren't many companies that are prepared to do that. Now, I can see the Alberta government getting involved, adding in money from the Heritage Fund or whatever to help boost this along as a short-term loan to get the project on its feet. But Ottawa is hoping against hope that no one will step forward, and then they'll say, well, we could. we tried, but the private sector has signal market has telling us that there is no market for this.
And if they try that, which I think you're right, I think that's the play here. I think because, this guy wrote this book, okay? This is Mark Carney's book, okay, that he wrote while he was the UN Special Envoy for climate something something, okay? And all through here, he says things like 80% of oil and gas needs to remain in the ground. He repeats the statement that 90% of the world's energy requirements can be met through wind and solar. He also, very interestingly, refers to things like gasoline and diesel-powered vehicles, natural gas hot water heaters, things like that, as stranded assets for the future, including power plants that run on natural gas, which rang a lot of alarm bells. So what we're dealing with here right now, I find is interesting. We have him now as prime minister saying things like, I'm into nation building, let's make this happen. I can see the optimism, the little glimmer of hope on Daniel Smith's face. I can. And they're willing to try and believe him. But I think ultimately it's going to be what you just said. They're going to set it up so that it looks like it's a real thing. And then they're going to try to say with a straight face, oh, there's no business case for oil. As if,
Well, you go back to 2017, I think it was. You got the Energy East pipeline. The Trudeau government moves the goalposts on that thing 3 times. They make it tougher and tougher and tougher until finally TransCanada Pipeline, TC Energy, backs out of they've spent $1 billion getting that project approved, and then they back out because the federal Liberals keep changing the rules over and over and over again. And then Trudeau has the gall to say, well, it wasn't us. That was a business decision that killed Energy East. No, it wasn't. It was governments jerking around. And governments will jerk around on this. They're not going to, for instance, get rid of the Impact Assessment Act. They're going to say, well, we can suspend the Impact Assessment Act in this case because Bill C-5, the new nation building project bill, gives us the authority to override our own bills on this. But they're not going to they're not going to get rid of the Impact Assessment Act. And so that's a real problem for these guys. But maybe it's not a problem because maybe that's what they really want, is they want to make it look like they're working hard to please Alberta and the West. And really what they want to do is make it look like we frustrated ourselves.
Albertans see through that, though. And to your point on the sovereignty and separation movement, I've been telling some folks over the phone, they're like, how's it going out there with this movement? I'd say it's kind of simmering right now. But the moment you block something like this and it's revealed that you're actually going to keep the cap on energy, that you're going to keep blocking pipelines, it's going to hit a rolling boil, like right away.
Yep. And the first time we go through a winter where it's minus 48 and they've told us all to get heat pumps and now we're freezing in our homes, that's also, if we haven't left before that, we'll leave after that. There's so many things that this government is unprepared to give up. It's unprepared to give up the net zero power grid mandate that it has. It's unwilling to give up the tanker ban on the West Coast, which, if you look at it closely, means a ban on oil. Only oil from Alberta and parts of Saskatchewan are covered by that ban. I mean, there's all of these things where they've deliberately set out to demonize the West, and they're not going to give up on those. They're hoping that this new Bill C-5 will allow them to override some of the most egregious parts of their previous bills. But they're not prepared to dismantle those bills. That's the key. And so that ultimately they can say, we tried really hard, but nobody stepped forward to do this. Of course, with the Impact Assessment Act, it could, under that act, take between 5 and 7 years to get approval for a pipeline. It would cost the company that wanted the permits somewhere in the neighborhood of $1.5 to $2 billion just to get the permits. That's when we haven't put an inch of pipe in the ground yet. So that's what I think they're aiming for. And you and I were talking a little bit before we started recording about David Eby in BC. he's doing the same thing. Like he said, oh, I'm not against the pipe. No, don't get me wrong. I'm not against the pipeline. I like the idea of pipeline, but there are no private champions for it now. And I just don't want to see a lot of public money go into it. I don't want to see a lot of public money go into it either. I am offended. I'm pleased that the Trans Mountain extension, the expansion got built. But I am offended by the fact that the federal government spent twice as much money as that pipeline cost just to get the rights to it. And then that should have cost them about $7 to $9 billion to finish the project, and they paid about $32 billion to finish the project. I'm with EB. I don't want to see that happen again either. But everybody like EB and Carney and the federal Liberals all are acting in ways that people who have to put forward billions of dollars in risk are watching, and they're saying, yeah, these people aren't serious. They don't really want us in there. And so if we went ahead, we would lose our money, and then our shareholders would rightly be unhappy with us. So I think that's what's on the books or on the burner right now, is that they're simmering this whole idea that, gee, there's no business case for it. The market has spoken. It doesn't want another pipeline. When that's not it at all. If you deregulated, decided there was going to be a big pipeline to the East Coast and another one to the West Coast, those pipelines would be full and busy for probably another 30 years.
Especially with what's going on overseas, because looks like they're going to be relying on Alberta oil more than they thought they were going to be.
Yes.
To your point, you said the word acting, and I think that's exactly the right word. I think this is mostly theater. And eventually that curtain will come down and the lights will come on and people will be just as mad as they were before, if not more. Lastly, Lorne, I wanted to get into, it's totally connected with what we were talking about. You mentioned the electricity grid. You mentioned heat pumps, which of course run off of electricity. And that brings us to the looming ban on the sale of normal gasoline and diesel powered cars and trucks. Now, some folks are like, oh, that's happening in 10 years. No. It is starting in 5.5 months, folks. That is when these restrictions start kicking in. That's when it's going to start really warping the market. In fact, if you call up a car dealership who have to deal with stock and availability of cars and trucks, they're probably running into these restrictions already. What I found interesting, Lorne, is that it isn't just this crazy restriction that is coming down on cars and trucks being sold at dealerships, where if they're going to wind up with a whole bunch of EVs or battery-powered cars that people don't want to purchase, they're stacking up. It's that the feds are setting up this weird credit system again, where these car sellers get to earn green credits. And if they don't make their quota of sales for that year, they can use some of the credits. Like, it sounds like the mess of the second carbon tax over and over again. And people are just getting rich.
It's way worse.
Yeah.
I think it's way worse. The Parliamentary Budget Officer about 2 years ago tried to determine what it would cost in order to make the Liberals, the Trudeau Liberals, EV mandate work by 2035, where you're correct. By next year, we have to be 20% electric. By 2030, we have to be 65% electric, and by 2035, we have to be 100% electric. Well, we are now that the federal subsidy ended in January, we are about 8% of cars sold in Canada, and that's light trucks to pickup trucks and delivery vans. About 8.7% of those sold in the first quarter of 2025 were electric. We're supposed to be at 20% next year. We were never higher than 14%. And I don't see how, even if you doubled those federal subsidies to car buyers, made them 10,000 instead of 5,000, I still don't think you're going to get to 20%. And the manufacturers have all started to scale back their EV production, which means suddenly you have 20% demand for EVs. You don't have 20% supply for EVs. The practical side of all of this, it's unavoidable. You cannot get away from it. For instance, the estimate is that we would need about 700,000 charging stations in Canada once 2035 comes around and everything is EV. We'd need about 700,000 charging stations. I think that's actually an underestimate, but let's go with 700,000. We currently have 30,000. And if you figure that backwards over the 10 years from 2035 back to today, that means we would have to double the number we already have this year alone. So on top of the 30,000 we have, we'd have to install 60,000. And we would have to install 60,000 every year for 10 years to even come close to the number we're supposed to have when they're all EVs. And then there are other practical problems. I mean, I can go on and on and on about statistics about how people don't want these things. They're not being sold. You take the subsidies away and the market falls by half for these things. But some of the really practical things is, okay, you would need to build probably 12 Site C dam power projects between now and 2035 if we go to fully electric vehicles, and they all have to be charged. Well, where are any of those being built? Where is they talk about, well, there's no private company stepping forward to build pipelines. There's no private company stepping forward to build their power plants either. And so, you're going to have, in 10 years, you might have 50 or 60% of the fleet in Canada as all electric. But where are you going to plug them in? Where is this going to? My wife and I decided, we have some friends who had their house rewired to 200 amps because in order to get to the level 2 charger, which takes about 4.5 or 5 hours for a car, you have to have 200 in your house. And they went and did it. They don't have an electric, but they thought, the city's only allowing 6 or 8 per neighborhood of these rewirings. So let our house be one of them. So we thought, that makes some sense. We'll do that too. And I phoned their electrician, and he comes over, he knocks on the door, and he's looking around and said, I already tell you now I can't do 200 here. I said, what do you mean you can't? He said, you're all underground power. I can only do 200 if you're wired above the ground. And he said, so I could put 125 in for you. We got 100 now, like most houses. I could put 125 in for you, but then I'm going to have to put a regulator on it so that in the middle of the summer, if you're running your air conditioners and you're charging the car, the regulator will shut one of those off. So either you're not going to charge your car or you're going to sweat like a pig in bed because you can't have the air conditioner on. And so I said, okay, well, fine. I don't want to do that, but let's have some fun here. I explained who I was and why I was writing about this. And he said, well, I said, what's this going to cost? He said, about $16,000. Well, who's going to do that? The Transport Canada already came out this morning with I guess it actually came out yesterday. It was reported this morning. They have a survey of who would buy electrics as their next vehicle. And no one who makes under about 80,000. And I'm serious when I say no one. 99% of people who make under 80,000 would not consider an EV. It is an upper middle class and upper class interest. That's all there is. And, everybody we know lots of people who have EVs. For all of them, it's at very least their second vehicle. And in most cases, it's their third vehicle. And so it's a virtue signal, right? They got some money. It's kind of a fun little gadget. Maybe we'll bomb around town in it for all. But nobody's taken one into northern Alberta in January from Edmonton without knowing where they're going to be able to charge or how long it's going to take. I sat next to a guy yesterday. I was in Olds, Didsbury, Three Hills, the place where there's going to be a by-election, one of the 3 places there's going to be a by-election today. I sat next to a guy who was at a charging station. I was watering my dogs. And I said to him, how long have you been here? He said, about 20 minutes. I said, how much longer do you think you're going to be? He said, probably about another 10, and then I'll have the charge that I need to keep on going. I'm not stopping anywhere for half an hour to fill my car. I have 3 rules about EVs. They have to cost the same to the engine, the power system has to cost the same as an ICE. Right now, they're about $8,000 to $12,000 more expensive than an internal combustion engine. They have to go as far, and work as well in the winter. None of them do. And you have to be able to recharge as quickly as I can refuel. And I used to have a truck. Took, about 12 minutes to fill it up and go inside and get some jerky and a Coke and come back out and get in the cab and drive off. I said, our son used to live on the coast. It was an 11.5-hour drive from our house to his apartment. And I could make one stop with my truck. In Blue River. So in the middle of interior BC, I'd stop there. I'd go in. First, I'd fill up. I'd go in. I'd get my snack and my beverage. And I'd be back on the road in under 15 minutes. Well, you can't do that with, not yet. Will there be better batteries come along? I am confident of that. The technology will improve. But then you can talk to me about doing this. You can't tell me now that this is a good idea.
And what you just described there is called supply and demand. This is the demand. So people's lives, as Dr. Jordan Peterson has pointed out the obvious, are infinitely complex. You have a million reasons to drive the vehicle that you drove in the past and to drive the vehicle that you're driving now. And how many Canadians do we have that own their own personal vehicles and what they use them for? And the idea that the government, which is made up of individuals who have their own problems, can turn around and start doing this visionary utopia dream program and start dictating how people drive and what energy they use in order to drive is nuts. To your point, just on the energy requirements, Lorne, I sat there and did the raw math. Just the personally owned private vehicles. I'm not talking trucks. Forget about delivery vans. Privately owned vehicles parked in people's garages right now or your driveway. We would need 14 CANDO reactors tomorrow
I'm sure.
to charge those things. Not talking about transmission lines, charging stations, nothing else. That's all more. 14. Each of those suckers costs around $13 billion to build and 10 years each. So, we do not have the power. You or I are here in Alberta, and in the wintertime, we get warnings on our phone saying there's going to be a grid outage. Don't use your hairdryer. Unplug your toaster. Do you think...
And that is because we've moved substantially away from coal to natural gas. We could accommodate the demand with natural gas, but now we also have to use wind and solar. And there was a time a year and a half ago in January when it was minus 48 in much of Alberta. And you have to turn the wind turbines off because the blades will freeze and then they'll break off and it causes no end of expense and repair. And of course, it's cold. The sun is kind of sort of out in January, but not really. And it's only out for about 8 hours. So you can't do it. It's not a ideological thing. It's a practical thing. It's pragmatic. And so that's where we're at. But getting back to the EV mandate just imagine the federal government saying, we know you want a house, but for the good of mankind and for the planet, everybody really should live in small condos. That's the best way for us to manage our resources and reduce the footprint of people's living experiences. So we're going to deny you a house and insist the only thing you can buy is a condo. It's the same with vehicles. We know you drive 700 kilometers into far northern Alberta or northern Ontario, northern Quebec, and that would make it much easier to have diesel or gasoline powered engines. But for the good of the planet, we don't think you should have a truck to start with. So we think you should buy a small electric vehicle, and that's all you're going to be able to buy. Quebec has gone even further than the feds have. Quebec have said that after 2035, you will be unable to buy parts for ICE, for internal combustion engine cars. So you might have one and you're trying to milk it for as many years as you can before you actually have to go and buy an electric. No. You're going to be unable to buy the replacement parts. So what does that mean? It means everybody in Quebec is going to drive to Ontario or New Brunswick to buy the parts that they need. But nonetheless, It's the mentality of it that says you must do as the government says. And you know what? In a free country, that's pretty damn bold of the government to decide that it can tell us what kind of vehicles we're going to do.
You said a mouthful there within a free country. We're just going to wrap up here soon, Lorne. But I just wanted to go over a little bit of your personal anecdote, which is excellent. That personal experience is excellent. So to be clear, you got an electrician over to your house. He said even if he could do it, it would cost about 15 grand. And your stuff's all underground, so no soup for you. And if he did put it in, he would need a regulator put on that thing so that you would get to choose between being able to be mobile to move around in your vehicle, charging it, or air conditioning.
Yep.
Okay,
Exactly.
folks, multiply that across all these millions of Canadians who own private vehicles and their own personal circumstances and lives. This is why the government should never tell you what kind of vehicle you are able to purchase and to drive. Furthermore, the cost alone, if you don't believe me, look, this is Natural Resources Canada, okay? Go check that out. It's their own website. They're estimating, Lorne, I know you've read the same stuff, they're estimating it's going to cost upwards of $300 billion.
Yep.
I hate to put...
Yep.
Go ahead.
And then they commit to that as though it's deciding between having chocolate milk or lemonade at lunch. Like there's no real consequences because it's not their money. They're spending other people's money. And so, of course, it makes no difference to them. And it makes them feel good about themselves. That's the problem with progressives all the time, is that they will make the rest of us do stuff so that they can feel good about themselves. They've done the right thing. They're morally superior. They're intellectually more sophisticated than the rest of us. And so they feel entitled to tell us.
Well, if they want to go join their own commune in the mountains of the Kootenays, seriously, and grow their own food and go solar, like go barefoot. I grew up on Vancouver Island, okay? I was around a lot of folks who were living off the land. Go fill your boots. Don't tell other people how to live, especially when we can't afford this. I need to point this out. We have unmoney right now. Unmoney. We are more than $1 trillion in debt. The interest we are paying alone on the debt is more than the line item that we spend on national defense. That's how deep we are in debt.
And it will, within the next 2 or 3 years, surpass what we spend on health.
It's $1 billion a week, folks. Picture a brand new hospital ready to go, burning down every week. That's how much we're spending on interest on the debt. And these jokers are thinking we're going to be able to throw $300 billion at a project nobody wants. Lorne, lastly, I'm going to get you to make a call here.
Yep.
I think that Carney's just going to run up against darkness in the winter and math here. I think he's going to have to throw this overboard and say, yeah, that was the last guy's plan. We're not doing this anymore, despite all that stuff he wrote in that book. Like, if you read that book, he's more extreme than Guilbeault. But I think he's just going to have to cut line on this. What do you think's going to happen at this?
Well, eventually they will. Julia DeBruzen, who's the new environment minister, said about 10 days ago that, well, there is some flexibility inside the EV mandate law. I didn't see it when I looked in there, but what they're signaling is that maybe in the next few years we're going to have to scale this back a bit or make some alterations, make some changes. But she has said, DeBruzen said last week, that they're going to come back with their $5,000 a vehicle subsidy for buyers of EVs. That's because the federal government has put about $33 or $34 billion into EV plants. Ontario and Quebec have put about another $20 billion in there, and they have to save that investment. That was a bad gamble, is what that was. It was nothing but gambling. It had no investment end to it at all. They're chasing their gambling losses, and they're going to try and force us to buy cars that we don't want, EVs, with our own money. And it staggers me. And this would have been a very, very good way to say, hey, we're different from the Trudeau guys. We've thought these things through. We understand the practical problems. But no, they haven't done that. They're clinging to this for now. And I think why they're clinging to this is they want someone to step forward and get them a pipeline. They wouldn't mind really doing the pipeline as long as they're not putting money into it. So that's going to make their environmental base angry. So they're going to be able to say, oh, yes, but look, we're doing this whole EV thing. And isn't that wonderful? You like that? You like the EV, you like the impact assessment, you like the net zero grid. And they're hoping it'll all sort of balance out in the end with their base. It's ridiculous.
I want to go back to the 80s where we were worried about endangered species, Lorne. Thank you so much for your time today.
Okay.
That's
bet,
Lorne
Kris.
Gunter, of course, guest friend here on the Candice Malcolm Show and columnist for the Edmonton Sun. Go check out his recent writing where he also talks about this ridiculous battery-powered car mandate that is a non-starter. Thank you so much for watching the show. We'll catch you next time.
You're watching Juno News, Canada's fastest growing independent news network. Our team works day and night to bring you nationwide coverage of the issues that matter, honest reporting of the stories that put Canadians first. From far and wide, Juno is doing the work to turn the dial in the right direction, bringing you the news from the field and in the studio. Wherever it takes us, we get the job done. For you and for Canada. Help us replace the CBC. Subscribe today at junonews.com.